So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Erin Simpson. She is a defense analyst turned executive with experience across defense industry. She has lectured widely on the future of war, analyzing complex conflicts, and the role of intelligence in irregular warfare. She is also the co-host of Bombshell, a boozy national security podcast from War on the Rocks. Dr. Simpson spent 5 years at Karas Associates, where she helped build an experimental startup into a cutting-edge DC consulting firm, leveraging social and data science analysis. As CEO of the company in 2016, she presided over its successful sale. Before her time at Karas, she served as the strategic advisor on ISAF's Counterinsurgency Advisory and Assistance Team and was an assistant professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Marine Command and Staff College in Quantico, Virginia. She holds degrees from Harvard and the University of Kansas. It's a pleasure to welcome Erin Simpson.
Hi, good morning. Do the short person thing and adjust that microphone. One of those basketball teams is much better than the other, and that's why they get a pin when on basketball day. So I don't get to lecture on counterinsurgency very much anymore. My current job is with Northrop Grumman, and they build airplanes, and so we don't do as much of this as I used to. But this is a real treat, and I want to thank Mike Noonan for inviting me out here. Thank all the organizers and sponsors for a really fun dinner last night, and for folks who saw the cover band at Mullins afterwards. It was quite an anthropological experience for everyone involved. So we've got a lot to get through. I think probably with most of the lectures that you have here, I just want to confirm you guys are seeing, oh, you didn't get that, there we go. Each of these slides could be 45 minutes in their own right. Right, you could have a whole semester course on insurgency and counterinsurgency, and particularly with Iraq and Afghanistan. So we're kind of going to do wave tops upon wave tops. Hopefully we've saved enough time at the end for good discussion, and we'll get going from there. So let us, pretty straightforward agenda. Being an academic by training, I can't not start with theory. But what I wanted to help, we're not going to be able to get into all of the details in Iraq and Afghanistan the way that the other folks might be interested in, and so I wanted to try to provide a framework that would help you dig into some of these topics more deeply on your own and to work with your students to do that as well. So counterinsurgency theory. Have to start with the definition. This is taken from the Field Manual 324, which the Army Marine Corps put out together in 2007. And what you'll notice from that definition is that it doesn't really say anything, right? It's just all the stuff you might come up with to defeat an insurgency. And that's basically correct, right? So we'll unpack that a little bit more, but that's mostly the working definition, even doctrinally, of counterinsurgency. And so I know Mary Habeck's going to talk about counterterrorism next. Austin's going to talk about security assistance. Those are all things that could also fall under a counterinsurgency campaign. And so counterinsurgency is a really kind of high-level strategy approach. Fundamentally, it's about separating insurgents from the population. We're going to talk about insurgents here in just a second. And counterinsurgency really is an exercise in competitive governance. And I think that that's the lens that I most use when I think about counterinsurgency. That's what distinguishes it from counterterrorism or security force assistance. It is really about how the government is going to compete with the insurgent governance structure, kind of at the very local level. We'll dig into that a bit more. In terms of doctrine and in terms of the way the United States tends to think about counterinsurgency, we use this phrase whole of government approach, which we don't really say out loud very much anymore, but was very popular in 2007 and 2008, probably going into 2009. And again, I think it's important to realize all the different lines of effort that can go into a counterinsurgency campaign. So that would include economic development and reconstruction, policing, security sector reform, as I said, counterterrorism, and security force assistance. These are all of the things that one might try to do to shore up the effectiveness of a local government. And I think it's pretty useful here also to note that we don't conduct a lot of counterinsurgency operations directly as Americans anymore, right? The western frontier closed 100 some plus years ago. There's not a lot of like wars of domestic conquest that we're currently participating in. We are usually doing counterinsurgency in support of a host nation government overseas somewhere. And that's actually a quite important distinction, and we'll try to balance those two elements as we talk about this. The theory part really focuses on what that host nation government should be doing. Our role in that is a little bit more challenged. But the most important thing about counterinsurgency is that before you do any strategic design, before you do any campaign planning, you should understand the insurgency that you are fighting against. You should first understand, is it in fact an insurgency? Which can be a kind of challenging diagnostic question. So what are insurgencies? Again, we'll take a definition from the field manual. An organized movement aimed at the overthrow of a constituted government through the use of subversion and armed conflict. That definition is doing some work, actually, right? An organized movement. There is some organizational structure, right? These are not a series of lone wolves. This is not a leaderless resistance. There is actual organization and structure. Those structures can vary, certainly, but there's an actual organization in play when we talk about insurgencies. Aimed at the overthrow of a constituted government, they are making a political challenge for political control, either at the national level or possibly for a more separatist effort. There's some, you can go either direction on that. But this is a political campaign, right? Through the use of subversion and armed conflict. And both of those things are important there, right? So armed conflict is the part that we're used to seeing, right? This sort of guerrilla tactics and maybe some what we might call terrorist activity, attacking civilians or attacking other government installations. Subversion is the part that really characterizes insurgencies from other forms of either political opposition or armed conflict, which is this political organizing kind of below the detection threshold, which we'll talk about in just a second. So subversion is recruiting candidates that might be sympathetic to your political campaign, to your political effort, but without declaring them overtly public. So think about communist subversion during the Cold War, right? You're wanting to make sure that you are working, the librarians, the dog catchers, the teachers, the doctors, everyone at a local level to come around to your orientation to the political struggle, right? So subversion is meant to be, we usually talk about that in a sort of, kind of espionage, or it's very, I'm missing the word here. I haven't had quite enough coffee this morning. Kind of underhanded, right? And that's exactly the point. It's all the political organizing work that you can do without attracting the attention of the security forces, right? It's all of the work and all of the mobilization that you can do before the government realizes, oh crap, there's an insurgency, right? We'll try to get into that a little bit more. When I talk about insurgency, and this, of course, is a sort of thing, we can debate definitions as the day is long, which tends not to be very interesting, so we won't. But insurgency implies a strategy, describes a strategy, and implies an organizational structure. And it's not just about the guerrilla tactics, right? Those are the easiest things to see, these sort of spectacular attacks or nighttime attacks or whatever, but that's not per se what defines an insurgency. So let's try to unpack this a little bit more, right? So violence, those guerrilla tactics, are only the tip of the iceberg. So this is that detection threshold we talked about there, that's the part that's easiest to see, and certainly easiest for the state or the local government to see. They see when there are bombings or attacks on civilians. They don't necessarily see these pieces underneath, right? The intelligence networks, right? The recruiting of sources in local ministries, local police forces, media organizations. They don't see the way that civilians are helping with logistics and recruiting, right? So in order to stay out of sight of the national authorities or even the local authorities, you need to be able to get new people and move those people around, and probably also move some guns and bullets and, blow up thingies around as well. You do that with civilians, right? So this underneath part of this iceberg, the iceberg, it's like 10% of the problems you can see, right? Underneath is this much larger base, potentially, of civilian support. If you're running a good insurgency, this is a version of what your structure sort of looks like. You have built on top of kind of probably a relatively indifferent population base, a set of sympathizers, some active supporters, people who are actively moving food and fuel and weapons for you, and then you have your actual fighters on top of that. But the fighters are just the tiniest bit. And so when people say things like, you can't kill your way out of an insurgency, this is one of the reasons why. Because that's just the tiniest bit. It's just the most visible or active part of the organization. It does nothing potentially to address the intelligence networks that the insurgency has built, the sympathizer networks that the insurgency has built. And so this is sort of defines the problem in a lot of ways for how we think about counterinsurgency campaigns. The other piece here, and I think we all sort of implicitly know this, but it creates a really genuine intelligence problem, is that many of those insurgents and terrorists, those who are people who actually are actively committing violence, just fold back into the civilian population at will, right? So there's a quote in a different slide deck that I use, where it's like, we've gotten the insurgents down, to only a few hundred, in this particular province. And it's like, well then, sir, why do you need tens of thousands of troops? We don't know which ones they are, right? We call that the fundamental identification problem. And that's the intelligence challenge that you're always trying to solve in a counterinsurgency campaign. That's why you want to separate the insurgents from the population so that you can identify those active members more readily, protect the civilians, and kill or capture those active insurgents. And that makes the population the center of gravity. Sometimes this is phrased as the population is the prize. There were a lot of aphorisms that came out of the doctrine in 324, which I certainly had a hand in writing, although I don't think I did a lot of the aphorisms. Aphorisms are helpful, but they also can be easily distorted. And so one of the reasons I don't love population is the prize is that it makes it sound like the population is just this sort of agentless actor in the system. They're to be protected. They have nothing to do with this crazy war going on around them, and that's to misunderstand the role of the population and what the population actually is. You want to protect the population, so they'll tell you who the bad guys are, right? It's a very deliberate effort on that part. Okay. So when we think about insurgent groups, and we're not going to go into these in detail, but this is sort of how thinking about an insurgency as an organization. You could actually use a lot of these questions to understand a nonprofit organization, a veteran service organization, an education foundation, right? This is what's your relationship with the donors and how do you recruit new members, right? This is almost sort of basic business strategy. These are the sorts of things that really help distinguish different kinds of insurgent groups, right? So when we talk about Iraq in a minute, there is some variation on these dimensions between al-Qaeda in Iraq and the leftover revolutionary brigades. It certainly distinguishes the Iraqi insurgents from the Taliban, for example, which would answer these questions quite differently. So again, if the population is the center of gravity, the first thing I always want to know about an insurgent group is what is the relationship with that group between the population? Do they actually have that structure we just talked about? Do they actually rely on local civilians for intelligence and supplies? If they don't, you may not want to have a counterinsurgency campaign against them. You might be able to do counterterrorism. You might be able to do local policing, right? So this is very much about diagnosing the problem properly. Again, because the insurgency is a political organization, you want to get a sense of the nature of its political character. Are they running a communist subversion that there's a well-defined playbook for? Are they running out of a radicalized religious structure? Are they very cell-based? Or are they widespread and operating in the open, right? You want to get a sense for how widespread, how good they are at political organizing, how much subversion has gone forward, and not just focus on the violent acts, right? It's very easy to get distracted by that spectacular attack and to forget the political organizing that sits underneath it. Sources of recruitment, right? So insurgent groups, one of their biggest challenges is recruiting new folks. And we'll talk in a minute about some of those strategies, but they can be coercive, they can be popular uprisings, but those are also going to vary. Is there a particular part of the country that the insurgency draws from? Is there a particular ethnic group that the insurgency draws from? And what is the role of coercion in that as well? Sources of revenue are one of my favorite things because I'm a giant nerd. But it also really sort of shapes how an organization, an insurgent organization runs. And it also shapes, it's really good for intelligence collection and targeting on the government side. Insurgent groups that collect revenue through taxes really start to look like local governments, right? They are actually going out there. The Taliban does this. The Taliban collects more in tax revenue than the government of Afghanistan has in probably 50 years. There's a lot of legwork and organizing and political mobilization that has to be done to physically collect taxes from farmers in rural places, right? There's just like a lot of logistics involved in that. On the other hand, if you're totally externally funded, you may not have to rely on your local civilians that much, right? So if your sources of revenue require you to actually have a relationship with civilian population, that's going to be different than folks who might have access to minerals or drug money or external financing, right? So Jeremy Weinstein has a pretty good book that tries to get at some of these pieces, and one of the things that's different is that there's long-term versus short-term payoffs is one thing that changes. So if you have, taxes and you're building this movement and the payoff is winning the war, right? We're all going to get rich when we actually take over the government. That's really different than you've got a conflict economy where we're all getting rich right now, right? That's very short-term. That attracts a different kind of recruit than the long-term true believer on the insurgent side. Again, role of external sponsors. This is something that, for me, was never that interesting, because it's like, well, yeah, that's probably better if you could have one. But it turns out it's really important if you're like a third-party counterinsurgency sponsor. So if you're trying to help a local government, but the insurgent that you're fighting against is really well-funded externally. Also, if they have a very well-established external sanctuary. Sanctuaries end up being really important for insurgents, both for getting started. It's actually quite difficult to start an insurgency. Most don't survive the first year, but if you survive the first year, you can go for a very long time. The fundamental identification challenge is a challenge once you're above a certain threshold. Before that, states often can nip things in the bud fairly easily. But there are a variety of different kinds of sanctuaries, and this is, I think, found fairly often in the popular culture discussions of insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, mountains, jungles, across the borders. There's an active debate about whether or not you can have some sort of sanctuary in an urban environment and what urban insurgencies look like. And I don't think that the jury is really in on that just yet, but some interesting pieces. Ability to operate in the open, broader regional context. These are all things, if your external sponsor is the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union stops existing, the end to your insurgency is going to look different than if you could have fought on indefinitely, right? So it's fun to really dive into the very, very local dynamics, but you can't talk about Afghanistan without talking about Pakistan, and you can't talk about Afghanistan and Pakistan without talking about the Cold War, right? So you always want to make sure you zoom up just a little bit to get that broader context. Okay, so we can sort of think about these things in terms of the insurgents don't just want to be nice to the civilians and win a popularity contest, and to be honest, neither do the counterinsurgents. And so there's a fair amount of effort to establish control over a population. And this set of concepts goes back really far, but is popularized currently by a guy named Stathis Kalivas with this idea of control being really local to a conflict, that all of the violence and all of the stuff that goes on in an insurgency or a civil war is really driven by efforts to establish local control. And there's some different ways in which that goes about. So again, we'll come back to both Al-Qaeda and the Taliban here. I thought about updating this and putting ISIS on here, and I wasn't exactly sure where to put it, which I think is probably the point. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was extremely coercive. There was very little effort to, quote-unquote, win hearts and minds, and that's the last time we'll use that phrase in this lecture. But very little effort to mobilize on the basis of a shared political identity or sort of put a positive vision forward. They were basically strict Leninists who wanted to make everything as miserable as possible so that people would think that Al-Qaeda was the only possible solution. There's actually pretty good recovered text that suggests that's the strategy. Hezbollah starts as a terrorist group in the 80s and manages to extend, through today across the entire spectrum. I mean, they're a political party in the Lebanese parliament now. They do a full range of social service provision, overt political organizing, but also still definitely maintain some coercive elements in the South as well. And the Taliban is somewhat similar to that. I mean, they're not quite in the parliament. interesting to think about whether or not they would want to be. But they offer quite a lot to the local population while still being really coercive. And I think it's important to note, I've always found it really analytically interesting to think about why would an insurgent group, provide court services or, notarize weddings and births and create birth certificates. There's some interesting answers to that. That's never to take away from actually the quite intense violence that they put against civilian populations, right? These things are all happening at the same time. I think we're just less surprised by insurgent violence than we are by insurgent governance, and that tends to attract a little bit more attention. But we need to be able to address both because the counterinsurgency strategy has to be able to address both. Point here from a population perspective, again, that it's not a popularity contest, is that they're looking for a sense of order. They will accept, regardless of kind of their pre-war political preferences, a number of groups that come in who can provide order and protect them from other sources of violence, right? You think about sort of, mob shakedowns, similar sort of mentality. I'm going to protect you from other sources of violence in a community, but it's not like it's a free choice for you, right? I mean, I'm coercing you into it, right? You're paying me for it, and oh, by the way, I'm also one of the sources of violence, right? So it's a challenging relationship to be sure, but populations will support groups that they don't quote unquote like, but they might be controlled by, right? That might have local control, that might be able to provide local security, and so insurgents and counterinsurgents are going to play on both sides of that equation. So this then comes to counterinsurgency as a struggle to govern. And we can think about all of these as elements of an effective counterinsurgency campaign: taxation, rule of law, public safety, movement control, lots of checkpoints. Those provide useful opportunities to collect information about who's going where. Essential services, political representation, and regulation of social and economic relations. I'll leave that up there for just a second if you always want to take some notes. Taxation ends up just being really interesting. You wouldn't believe that. You probably don't believe that, but it's true. And this is my, still my money quote on insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. A government that's losing to an insurgency isn't being outfought, it's being outgoverned. And I probably said that every single day I was in Afghanistan, and it's still true. It's not a question of military strength. It's a question of competitive governance. And so how do you get ahead of the insurgents on that front? Just a couple notes here on how insurgencies end, because I think it's relevant to both the stories in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's kind of a tipping point. There's some point at which, you can imagine on the flip side how insurgencies start, right? There's also a tipping point. There's a point where you go from being a tiny little group to potentially a mass movement, and you're creating a real problem, for the government. On the flip side, there's a point at which you have been winnowed down. People have fallen away, you aren't getting new recruits, maybe a lot of folks are in jail, maybe a lot of folks are dead. You've lost strength, you've lost control of local population. There's this tipping point. But down at the bottom of that curve, you can sustain, again, under that detection threshold, a fair amount of activity. You might be able to continue to sustain some subversion. You might be able to sustain some low-level terrorist-type attacks. But it's really hard to get those last 100 or last 1,000, right? You don't know where they are. And it's a real intelligence challenge for the local government and potentially for countries like the United States. This leads to negotiations sometimes. Part of that negotiating process is to remove the threat of those last remnants of the organization. And sometimes that means the insurgency organization shifts into something that has less of a relationship with the population. Maybe they found external sponsors, or they've found part of a conflict economy that actually lets them sustain over time. And so they might turn into more distinctly terrorist organizations, meaning they're not really depending on local civilians or criminal organizations. So there's the IRA has an interesting trajectory in this regard. FARC has an interesting trajectory in this regard. Lots of debate around, how do you really build that peace process to get that to end? But the other point here is that the real end game is, again, a political end game, right? What is the political negotiations by which you're either bringing folks into government or pushing out those organizations really fully. And I think that's actually captured by David Galula here really well, which is that you want the permanent isolation enforced by the population on their own, right? For the end of the organization to be sustained, for the peace to be sustained, it actually has to be organically sustained, locally sustained, such that they won't host those insurgent cells again. They wouldn't provide that support, provide that intelligence, provide that logistical support the next time around. And so that's really what you're looking for. And so it's really hard also for third parties like the United States to create on their own. How do you actually get over that hump as an outside power? That's why this is really about local dynamics and how you're building local security and those local intelligence networks. Okay. One last slide, I think, in the theory piece. I wanted to, since we're here with the first division and we're sort of talking about military mission sets, I wanted to give us an idea of typically who conducts counterinsurgency and what that force mix seems to look like. So usually these are conventional forces, as distinct from special forces, which we'll talk about. And they're usually ground forces. So for the United States, that's the Army and the Marine Corps. Marines, don't tell me that you're not ground forces. Primarily dismounted infantry units. They would get air support from their rotary wings and some of the close air support elements. But also a lot of intelligence support from the Air Force and the Navy in terms of what we call ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So people tracking bad guys. Tracking bad guys is mostly what they do. And then bombing bad guys. That's a lot of what goes on in that context. Some sort of communication support and battlefield management, but mostly from that perspective. Really significant emphasis on intelligence collection. My dissertation is on intelligence and counterinsurgency campaigns. Every soldier a sensor, every Marine a sensor. The point is that everybody out on patrol is collecting meaningful information, has access to civilians, and therefore has access to useful information to higher headquarters. That's really distinct from the idea that higher headquarters has all the intelligence you need collected from national assets, and they're going to push it down to you when you need it. This is a real reverse, and it's one of the biggest shifts in the way that the ground forces interact during the war on terror, is this emphasis that the person who knows the most about what's going on is a company commander, right? It's true, but it's also really challenging. We don't have great ways of moving all of that information up in a meaningful fashion. We did create some company-level intel cells. Advisors, folks who are going to work with local forces, folks who are going to train local police, Iraqi Army, Afghan National Army, these kinds of things. That's often been done in this context by conventional forces with, frankly, mixed results, but some other elements that have been more focused by the special forces. And then special operations forces, these are Rangers and SEALs and Delta and all kinds of colors and whatever, special mission units, and they're basically doing kill-capture raids. And it's often poorly coordinated with conventional forces. So everybody I know who's deployed on the conventional side to Iraq or Afghanistan had some story about, something they'd been working on with local actors for a long time, and then one night a SEAL team came in and killed 6 people, and their whole effort was dead, along with the 6 people. That got a little bit better, but I don't think it ever got super great. But that's kind of the force mix. I mean, it's very personnel intensive, right? There's a reason why we surged in both Iraq and Afghanistan. But that's more or less the kinds of folks who are doing operations here. Okay. Oh, and of course, diplomats and development officers, because this is actually political. So we talk all about the military elements of these campaigns and always forget that there's actually the political dimension is going to be carried out by diplomats and development officers. Okay. In the 15 minutes I have left, we will burn through both Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think this is an important bit of context. You can't actually talk about Iraq and Afghanistan without talking about the other, because there were such large numbers of troops involved in both, but they have to be offset, right? So Iraq, we invade Afghanistan before we invade Iraq, but the troop levels in Iraq are always substantially higher than Afghanistan until very late in the game, right? Until really, 2011 or so. That matters. what we do in Afghanistan for a decade is very much a function of what we were doing in Iraq for most of that decade. And so the troop presence and the intelligence assets were not available in the Afghan theater because they were all being consumed in the Iraq theater. So again, we want to start by thinking about what's the nature of the insurgency in Iraq. And this turns out is an incredibly fraught question. It was an incredibly contentious question in 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006. It really wasn't till the end of 2006 or the middle of 2006 that people started coming around to a more shared understanding that there was an insurgency in Iraq and that it had some definable characteristics. So it was a matter of great controversy after the invasion, and in 2004 and 2005 in particular, whether or not to say there was an insurgency in Iraq. I will posit that it's very difficult to design counterinsurgency operations if you don't agree you are fighting an insurgency. So we don't have a lot of counterinsurgency per se in Iraq until some Marines doing some interesting things in 2006 out in Anbar province, but the surge is what happens in 2007, which is both a shift in troop levels and in strategy. In terms of the conflict system here, again, both of these wars start with US invasions, right? So the insurgency per se don't exist prior to that activity, right? So the insurgency in Iraq ends up being kind of a mix of former regime officials, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which set up a local affiliate which had very unique characteristics that distinguished it from Al-Qaeda higher headquarters, and also a number of Iranian insurgencies or I don't know the right exact term for that, but Badr Corps and Sadr efforts to organize Iraqi Shia against the US and against the kind of what they perceived as a puppet government. You can see here sort of the 2006 dynamic, which involves really an intense level of violence and how that morphs by 2008. The other thing that's important to note when we talk about the Iraq conflict system is there's a Baghdad conflict system. There's the outer Baghdad conflict system, and then there's sort of the Anbar and the farther and the northern conflict systems, and those tended to be different, right? So Al-Qaeda is operating in all of those places, but the nature of their activity and their relationship with the population in Anbar province is really different than what's going on in Baghdad, where there's also a lot more Iranian influence as well. So in 2007, there's an announcement that there will be a surge, there'll be an increased number of troops, but there'll also be a new strategy, and that strategy is going to be informed by the new Counterinsurgency Field Manual, and will be conveniently implemented by one of its authors, that's General David Petraeus. And so one of the things, and we're not going to dissect the Baghdad security plan in literally any detail whatsoever, other than to note that there had been, prior to this, a lot of emphasis, or most American troops were housed on very large bases, Camp Victory, for example. And the criticism was that they were commuting to work. Right, they would go out on patrol, and they would come back to these very, very large bases. And that was not generating a great deal of significant results. So one element of the strategy in 2007 became to push folks out into joint security stations, combat outposts, and they would be jointly patrolled, manned by Americans and Iraqi forces in an effort to push folks out and actually provide that local security, right? You're gonna be there overnight, you're gonna be there for weeks. You are the face of security, and because you're pushed out further, you have a greater opportunity to get local intelligence, local information about what's going on in that very small neighborhood. That actually paid quite a few dividends. It takes place in a same time, but in a totally different dynamic than the Anbar Awakening, which you guys may have remember reading about at the time. But this was an effort to get local Iraqis, tribal sheikhs in particular, in Anbar province, which is a very large desert province, borders Syria for the most part, to themselves reject the influence and the presence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And there had been several efforts of an awakening previously. There had been several efforts to get the sheikhs and have the tribal dynamics to shift. And for one reason or another, many of which are still debated, the one that starts to take place in 2006 actually holds. And that's partially because there was some assistance from the United States, but I think there's quite a few other dynamics that drive that as well. But the conflict system in Iraq begins to shift as local Iraqis begin to reject Al-Qaeda and push back and undermine their effectiveness in Anbar province as well. I know we're going very fast, but hopefully this is making some sense. There's a lot of debate over, did this work? Did the surge work? Was counterinsurgency effective? And the answer mostly depends on your time frame, right? It absolutely changed the conflict dynamics present in Iraq in 2007 and going into 2008. We used to call this the waterfall graph, and you see the way that the lines begin to come down, on the my left side of that slide. Violence was dramatically reduced, right? Violence against Iraqis was dramatically reduced. The ability of the Iraqi government to govern was dramatically improved. The control of Anbar province was taken from al-Qaeda and returned in a variety of different ways to local control. That part of the campaign works reasonably well, actually. I think better than most people at the time probably thought. It wasn't necessarily sustained. It wasn't clear what the plan to sustain it was going to be, because we weren't going to keep 150,000 troops there indefinitely. And so there were some political advances, but maybe not sufficient. We'll come back to that here at the end. So there were a lot of, quote, lessons learned from Iraq. I sometimes put learned in quotation marks. It's not always clear exactly how well we learned them, but we learned them at the time. Some got forgotten a few years later. But the importance of an integrated civil-military plan, the role of bottom-up intelligence, a new innovation for reconstruction efforts, which were called provincial reconstruction teams, which they actually talked about over in the display in the museum. Money as a weapon system, which is the idea that you can just pay out lots of money locally and it'll help, which is actually kind of true, except when it's not. Dynamic targeting, some lessons on how you recruit and train local security forces, the Sons of Iraq program in Anbar province, for example, and some efforts on reconciliation. How do you reintegrate former fighters? How do you take folks who fought with Badr Corps or al-Qaeda who don't want to fight anymore? What do you do with them? Do they have to stay in prison forever, or is there a way to reintegrate them into some other security force or some other part of civilian life? These were all things that were heady policy discussions, and they informed a lot of what happened in Afghanistan basically a year later, right? So Iraq surge is in 2007 into 2008, and then in late 2009, we decide to maybe replay that strategy in Afghanistan. Again, this is that context. As you know, there's always more troops in Iraq. The peaks are certainly higher. But there's a surge of troops into Afghanistan and a concomitant change in strategy there as well. We're going to shift away from just sort of the force protection and some counterterrorism activity into a more whole-of-government counterinsurgency approach. So counterinsurgency in Iraq really lasts from probably 2007 to, 2009-ish, when we then begin drawing troops down more distinctly. In Afghanistan, counterinsurgency as a strategy really dominates, very late 2009, probably into 2011, 2012, when we switch more to an advising posture again. These conflicts are long. We think about them as counterinsurgency campaigns the whole time, but we're actually not conducting counterinsurgency operations most of the time. And I think that's an important piece of this, especially in Afghanistan. We are 100% not doing counterinsurgency in the first decade that we're in Afghanistan. In fact, we are the insurgents to start it, right? We roll in to depose the Taliban government in October of 2001. It's actually way more fun to be an insurgent than to be a counterinsurgent, as it turns out. Nobody got to ride horses, as far as I could tell, during the counterinsurgency campaign, but they definitely did while they were coming in with the Northern Alliance. Osama bin Laden and a bunch of other Taliban leadership slip out through Tora Bora later that year, and there's sort of this rump Taliban that's left both in Pakistan and in southern Afghanistan to potentially take seat again. So again, just sort of looking at our deployment history there, incredibly low numbers, well, not incredibly low, low for us, through 2007. And then there's sort of these incremental jumps in 2008 and 2009 before there's a real shift in strategy. Some of you may have seen this slide before. I've chosen to use some of the actual slides from military briefings, which meant I had to go back and download military briefings. That was a walk down memory lane I'm not sure that I needed. but well, I always called this the spaghetti graph, but this was an actual depiction of the Afghan conflict system. General McChrystal briefed this every time he briefed senior leadership or others in the theater on the nature of the insurgency in Afghanistan. And, you know, at one level, this isn't wrong. This is a pretty distilled assessment of the nature of the conflict system in Afghanistan. What it doesn't tell you is what the hell we're supposed to do about it, which isn't the nature of systems diagrams generally, but it does, I think, very accurately reflect how complicated and complex that conflict system was, and in particular, what compelling adversary the Taliban are, right? So they're often sort of painted as unsophisticated and, you know, illiterate, radical, Islamic freedom fighters of some sort. They actually have incredibly sophisticated governance structures. Like I said, they have very sophisticated tax collection systems. They have collected several different kinds of taxes. They are regularized. They can predict their income off their tax collection in a way that should put the Afghan government probably to shame. They provide court services that are much more effective and accessible than the formal court system. And they're incredibly coercive at the same time, right? So they're doing all of these things as part of their effort to control a population. And the history of the way the Taliban comes to power through this sort of power vacuum in the 1990s in Afghanistan is really part of this story. Imposing order in a chaotic system through a really draconian set of rules and religious practices, but in a way that was somewhat authentic to the southern Afghan experience, the Pashtun experience in particular. And that's still where they draw most of their political strength and freedom of movement from, is that southern and eastern part of Afghanistan. The counterinsurgency plan focuses on the south, focuses on Helmand and Kandahar. I was in Helmand for several months, but also parts of the east and these key terrain districts, which they thought were critical to government functioning. Pushed out tons of resources, including a lot of development and governance assistance. I always said that the indicator that I most wanted to know was how many the number of nights per month the district governor slept in the district. That was the thing that I was like most interested in. If I could have waved a magic wand while I was doing campaign assessments, that's what I wanted to know, because the answer wasn't very high. Most district governors in the violent districts didn't sleep there, didn't go there, didn't do very much there, because it wasn't safe. And so if they thought it was safe, they might stay there, and that would be a really good proxy for their perception and the population's perception of whether they could feel safe enough to interact and provide good intelligence to American troops. There were a lot of elements to this. One thing that's not noted here was an emphasis on building the Afghan army, and that was a key component of the campaigns in both Iraq and Afghanistan, again with somewhat middling success. Lessons from Afghanistan. It's not Iraq, which I think sort of came as a surprise to some folks. There's some challenges. If your strategy fundamentally from a counterinsurgency position, you want to separate insurgents from the population, and you want to link the population to the government. That works well if you have a good government to work with. It is more challenging if the government you work with is itself corrupt or predatory, and that was certainly a problem in parts of Afghanistan. We were actually quite effective in Afghanistan in training their special operations forces, the ANSOF. We've really struggled to train the conventional forces in a way that has produced meaningful security results. Part of that is because sanctuaries and foreign sponsors matter. The Taliban has had effective sanctuary in Pakistan since 2001, actually before 2001. And there's been the Pakistan intelligence services are quite good at providing training and critical material to elements of the Taliban. That's helped keep them up the technology ladder and given them new tactics and techniques, you know, over the years. It matters quite a lot. And now the conflict dynamic there is shifting a little bit. There are ISIS cells in Afghanistan as well. They have a different relationship. They tend not to draw as much on the local population. I don't think the Pashtuns or the Tajiks have much use for ISIS there. But they are able to draw on some of those other sanctuaries as well. And I think similar to Iraq, one of the most fundamental lessons from Afghanistan is the need to link that military and security strategy with a political settlement. What is it that you're achieving on the ground in terms of local security that gets you closer to a settlement? It's going to be very difficult, as we saw, as you sort of think about that drawdown line, to get the Taliban eradicated from Afghanistan, especially given the sanctuaries, especially given some of the affinities in the South. What's the political strategy? And it was never well articulated exactly what that political strategy was going to look like. And it's a similar, although slightly different challenge in Iraq. We didn't have a final status or a final political strategy there. We leave in 2011 into 2012, and it allows some space because the government in Iraq was not fully capable of maintaining that security presence on their own, allowed first Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then what became known as ISIS to return and kind of grow from those seeds that they had left before. And that's always the challenge, right, is how do you get not just that organizational strength down low, but get it so that it can't come back. And that's the counterinsurgency challenge in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I don't know what happens next is the short answer to all of that. All right, I think almost exactly on time.
Perfectly on time. What happens next is we thank you very much.
Yeah,
first.
good.
And then we'll take Q&A.
Please.
And for those who've been checking out her podcast, feel free to ask questions related to that.
Oh, yeah, sure. Happy to ask questions, answer questions on the
But
podcast.
not about the drinks.
That's, well, I mean, I don't know. We can talk about old fashions if they want to, but it's more exciting than counterinsurgency. Who has questions?
Right there.
We're doing tense. Okay, back in the corner, Gary?
Okay, go first. Oh,
James.
okay. Jim, good morning. Jim Feldman, Lakeshore High School, St. Clair Shores, Michigan. I have a question about female American personnel in predominantly Muslim countries in relation to counterinsurgency. Is it helpful to have women in uniform
Absolutely.
in these areas?
There was actually a pretty good display over in the museum on female engagement teams. There are, I'm trying to think a couple different ways to describe this. Women literally until this year haven't been allowed in combat units, so they have not typically been in infantry units on infantry patrols, but there have been hundreds or if not thousands of women obviously in logistics and intelligence units in particular. And it has been, I think, proven pretty useful to have women be able to go into villages, especially in Afghanistan, where it's just completely unacceptable to have a man who is not a family member present in your home, able to engage with those local Afghans in a way that their male counterparts cannot. Now, I always wanted to put like a very hard intelligence angle on this, but they very much did not want to be characterized as collectors, as intelligence collectors, and there were some doctrinal reasons and maybe some legal reasons for that. But fundamentally, the most useful thing from that perspective, that they'd be able to get information that their male counterparts cannot. They're also really good at flying airplanes, so they can do that too. Gary.
Gary Morris, McLean County High School, Calhoun, Kentucky. I have two questions. First, yesterday we had heard some things about the use of empathy as it applies to working in these situations. What role does that play in trying to defeat an insurgency? And then the second part is, how do you fix the problem of governments that are corrupt, thus making it harder for you to defeat the insurgency?
So if I had an answer to that second question, I probably wouldn't be standing here this morning, which is what I used to tell my students at Quantico when they asked me the same things. I mean, I think that is part of American strategic choice, right? How do we assess the strategic risks when we go into activities like that, right? And it's sort of easy, especially now, we're in year, 17 or 18, of these conflicts. It sort of just feels like they just kind of go on forever. There are choices made about troop levels. There are choices made about force employment almost every year in that process. We should let that inform those choices, right? This is one of the things that's interesting but also challenging, is especially if you've served overseas, in these conflicts, you have a lot of personal experience, and that informs and clouds your analytic judgment, right? And it's hard to distinguish them. I remember sitting in a briefing with the Afghan Threat Finance Cell, most of which ended up in a New Yorker article a few months later, about the challenges of the Karzai regime and the money, the embezzlement that was going on, in particular money going to Dubai. And I had spent the previous several months in Helmand province, and it was a bloody period, there. I remember coming out of that meeting, and it was the first time that all I wanted to do was go to the airport and go home, because I had just no interest in providing further American support for, bad real estate deals in Dubai. So the corruption piece, there's corruption and there's corruption, right? And that's, there's a ton of corruption in Iraq, as well, but it's a slightly more functioning state. Afghanistan, there was certainly, came to have an understanding of the way that money moved up and out through the system that I just always found really disheartening, and I never was able to really get my brain past that. The empathy question is a great one, and I think is actually really important in counterinsurgency, even just from the basic perspective of trying to understand why the insurgency is making progress, right? So why would anybody join? Why would anybody think that that's better than this, right? And that's really important to be able to think like an insurgent, both in terms of tactics and operations, but also in terms of recruitment and finance. What would an insurgent do in this particular context? But it's also important to think about what would civilians do. So there's a version of this brief that talks about sort of civilian strategies, what the population does. What the population's mostly trying to do is not get killed. They're mostly not interested in your, damn fool idealistic crusade, right? And so they hedge. They play both sides. In Afghanistan, it's very common to send one son to the national government army and one son to the Taliban. They'll avoid making a decision, right? And so you hear this frustration from Americans, who are working with them, that they can't get a clear answer, or they talk out both sides of their mouth. Well, yeah, like anybody who's alive in year 9 of this conflict didn't get there by, being real clear about which side they support. That's not how you stay alive. And so I think getting to that level of understanding of how civilians cope with this level of really systemic violence is really important. Empathy is a great way to think about that. We're just going to go around the room. Oh, here, yes.
Adam Hayes, Litchfield, Minnesota.
Hi.
I was wondering if in American history or other countries' history, is there an example of a really successful counterinsurgency model that we could replicate, or have they all pretty much gone the way ours have gone, periods of success and failure?
Yeah, I mean, this is the golden goose. I don't know if Austin, if you have a good, or Mary has a good example here. The ones, historically, Malaya is the campaign that most gets referenced in the kind of current context. French and Algeria, from a different perspective, they actually win the counterinsurgency campaign and decide they basically just don't want to win Algeria. American frontier, Syrians and Homs. It's a tough, the Philippines, the Magsaysay versus the communist insurgents in the Philippines in the 50s is pretty good. Oman, yeah. They're tough. El Salvador is another example in a very different model. It's an advisor model. It also helps when your sponsor, the communist sponsor, stops existing. I recommend that to all of my government partners. But yeah, I mean, this is tough. Now, when you think about the way that, Sri Lanka defeated the Tamil Tigers eventually, it seems. There are fighting insurgencies in your own backyard is really different from the way that we typically do it, which is to do it overseas. So I guess I should actually answer this question. It is my dissertation topic. There are 6, depending on exactly how you count, but the wins are better negotiated settlements. So it's like the Brits in Malaya, the Brits in Kenya, the French in Madagascar, and I don't even really know what that was about. An Israeli case, maybe, and I'm forgetting another one. But yeah, they're tough. Partially because the timelines are really long. So Portugal fights really effective counterinsurgency in Angola and Mozambique, for example. But it takes forever, and there's a coup back in Portugal, right? Has nothing to do with the battlefield dynamics. It was the political dynamics in Lisbon that end the wars. So.
Let me insert one question here.
Sure.
Are there films you would recommend for teachers on this, like Battle of Algiers?
Yes, absolutely. Battle of Algiers is quite. I should have. We had an old list of these on the old blog that I should have gone back and tried to find. Battle of Algiers is good, though complicated. I mean, it is you should be very deft in the teaching of Battle of Algiers. It's very easy to, root for Mathieu, and to come away with this conclusion that, not only is torture tactically effective, it's strategically effective, and that's a good way to go. That would not be my reading of the Battle of Algiers, but it's very easy to come away with that one. The wheat that shakes the barley is a good one. Northern Ireland, Cillian Murphy, and it's actually not Northern Ireland, it's Irish Republic, like the 1920s, is really good. Let me think, there are other... Rogue One has some pretty good insurgency dynamics, and the Row of Intelligence, depending on kind of what you're trying to get at there. Quiet American, which was not a perfect translation of the book, gets at kind of the third party role and how you never really understand what's going on, and why trying to do the right thing is an insufficient political motivation when people's lives are at stake. Austin, do you have any other suggestions on movies? Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yes, for sure. And Turn is an American revolutionary story that sort of, I think, gets at some of these things, especially kind of the home front dynamics of who you're supporting where. Mary? Okay, good. So that's a good starter pack for everyone.
Hello, Tyler from Raleigh, North Carolina. You spoke earlier about the importance of the political element of counterinsurgency strategy. So I was wondering, I think back to the 2010 election when Maliki and the State of Law Coalition lost seats. A lot that had previously been gained had been lost when the State Department decided to back Maliki all the way. Later on, these betrayed Sunnis maybe started aligning with the Islamic State.
Yep.
What do you think would be an appropriate response to that as far as like building better coordination and communication and strategy between the U.S. military and the diplomatic community?
We should do that. Yes. It's, there are moments you could tell a story of these wars, both of them, as stories of civil military cooperation or lack thereof. And there are moments, and they're referred to in these ways. They're referred to as the Zal Barno days, right, which is an early period in Afghanistan where Zalmay Khalilzad was the ambassador and Dave Barno was the 3-star commander. Dave Petraeus and Ryan Crocker got along very well, respected each other quite a lot, and were very effective. That did not characterize all such pairings, and for a variety of reasons. I was always surprised. I'm like an institutionalist by training. Like I believe in like preferences and organizational structures and hierarchy. Man, personality matters. Those people don't like each other, none of it works, which is really annoying to a political scientist. It's also really annoying when you're on the ground, but it's really true. And so part of that is people need to come up together. They need to spend more time together when they're not 4-star generals or career ambassadors. It's hard for the State Department. They have no resources. They don't have the training opportunities. And the military just plans circles around them. And yet the military often does not have the context or the nuance necessary to put things forward. This varies, right? But it is a genuinely fraught process. It's one solution or one piece is actually to devolve that the closer you are to the conflict, the more likely you are to cooperate. The closer you are to Washington, the more likely you are to be a pain. And so the more authorities that are devolved into theater or to local American actors, I think there's a better chance of getting a good outcome, as opposed to leaving it to the big bureaucracies, running it through an NSC process. But it's fraught, and it's definitely, this is go read The Ugly American. It's the same problem we had in, the 1950s in Indochina.
Erin Henricks, Oswego High School in Oswego, Illinois. You broke down the insurgency in Iraq in kind of like a 3-headed monster. We broke it down: Baghdad, Outer Baghdad, and Anbar. And I was just curious, what was your definition of Outer Baghdad? Are you talking like the neighborhoods around the peripheral? Or
Yeah,
like the
the
cities
belts.
around? Okay,
Yeah.
and then what was the major? Is that like the Mahdi army under al-Sadr and all that? Or?
Mahdi army was definitely in the city itself. There was, I think there was actually Al-Qaeda. I mean, they were running recruitment and infiltration operations through those neighborhoods.
Okay.
And so those were kind of routes to get bombs and other implements, IEDs, into Baghdad. There's a southern story there too, obviously, in Basra and elsewhere that we don't tend to talk about, partially because the Brits were there. But it's actually an important part of the story. I don't know if you guys did a peacekeeping section or not yesterday, but the Brits were like, hey mate, we got this. Like, they were very insistent that they knew everything that needed to be known about counterinsurgency because they've been doing it in Northern Ireland for so long, and there were lots of stories about soft caps and public patrols, and they got their asses handed to them because they completely missed. It was not violent, and so they were like, see, everything here is stable, and they missed all of the subversion that was happening under that detection threshold, and so spark went off one day, and they were caught completely off guard. And it became very violent very quickly, and they had not done the sort of prep work necessary to manage that. But there's sort of a different, more Iran-focused dynamic that's going on in that part of the country. Yeah, I did sort of great violence to both the actual insurgencies in these places. There is definitely some good work out there on trying to dissect Iraq in particular. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Jolly, and I work in Melbourne, Florida.
Oh.
Northrop Grumman is one of our
Sure
partners at my school. We are a STEAM school. And so I heard you, when you were introducing yourself, that you work at Northrop Grumman now. And so that piqued my interest. And my question for you is two, actually. Mm-hmm. What is your current role there? Mm-hmm. And also, how can I encourage my young female students to pursue more STEM-related, jobs in the future?
Excellent questions. So I'm a director of strategic planning, of which there's only like 500 or so. It's a 65,000 person company. I work in the corporate headquarters in the government relations team. And so I actually do a lot of work on kind of future operating concepts and kind of what we think things are going to need going forward, and how Northrop Grumman might be able to help in those complex security environments. If there's a B-21 that anyone would like, we could certainly add you to the list. So it's actually a quite neat job because it's kind of a mix of conflict analysis, but also a lot of industry and business strategy kind of work, which I enjoy. Women in STEM is a fascinating question. So I actually took a ton of math in college and was in a super nerdy math class. I had like extra math before school several years in a row. I mean, the thing to do, the boys aren't any smarter. Like, it's just like the whole mantra for everything. Like, they're really smart. Oscar and I were just talking about this. Like, I have many faults, but imposter syndrome is not one of them. Like, they're really good. Like, they just need to be reminded that there's nothing weird about the things that they're into. There's no inherent boy or girl toys or approaches or topics. The within group variation is always higher than the between group variation. So they might find themselves in the tails of one of those curves. I have like the world's worst spatial relations. It's not because I'm a girl, because my father is the exact same way. Like, do not give us a screwdriver. Like, we can't put things together to save our lives. But I can do double derivatives, like, as a day is long, right? And a lot of stats and other sorts of things. So it's kind of about finding puzzles. And so maybe it's trying to help them find puzzles, and then there are different tools that let them attack puzzles. And that's kind of a cool way to do it. So it's great to get women into STEM careers, but there's lots of room for everybody. These challenges are actually really hard, so we take all comers, as it turns out. So,
Chris Hughes, the Stanwich School, Greenwich, Connecticut. Could you comment on urban sanctuaries and in counterinsurgency? I'm thinking West Belfast and Derry, the IRA. And transitioning a counterinsurgency into negotiations in a peace process?
Yeah. So urban sanctuaries are pretty interesting. Historically, people have thought that it's very difficult to organize in a city, kind of Paris Commune type stuff. that's where insurgencies go to die. And it's just really difficult to get off the ground because there's so many state agents around and able to monitor all of your activity, wall you off, and then, arrest and destroy you. There's been, so then we have kind of, I guess there's sort of two pieces of this. Northern Ireland obviously has a lot of activity, has a lot of urban operations. Interesting question about what the nature of the sanctuary is there exactly, but certainly there were parts of Belfast that the Brits considered no-go areas for them, right? And that's essentially what you're talking about when you're talking about urban sanctuaries. Are there places that are considered no-go areas for whatever reason by state security forces? So that's, Belfast certainly has elements of that. In lots of places where there are informal settlements or really big sprawled out kind of mega cities, favelas, in Brazil, for example, are places where you might create some of that. And obviously a lot of what's gone on in Syria has sort of stoked this debate in terms of can you sustain an insurgency from these urban, areas as well. And I think it's a good question. It's not clear to me that they have sanctuary in those places, right? They have freedom of operations because of some limitations by the state agent. This is something that Austin and I have debated over the years, like just how you still would, for the most part, I think, not choose to start your insurgency in an urban enclave, right? It is actually the story of Battle of Algiers, right? The French win the Battle of Algiers because Ali Lapointe can't run an insurgency under the nose of the French officers, right? And so you still need someplace else to do the training, right? So you can organize some of the intelligence pieces and some of the direct attacks, but it's really hard to sustain all of the training and finance from that urban enclave. But it's definitely there will, I think, to the extent that these are competitions for control of populations and populations are increasingly urbanized, we will continue to see urban conflict as a feature of these wars. And so what that means in terms of the analysis, like how you break that up, is going to be really challenging, just as it was in Northern Ireland. Yeah, it's a good question. On negotiations, yeah, I don't have like a great systemic understanding of what generates good negotiations or not. You have to have like the deals that the Brits and French used to be able to make. They were colonial deals. So we give a group that we like independence in exchange for continued pressure against an out-group that we dislike, right? So the Malaya, the Malay Chinese are the insurgents. We can make the Malay majority a deal, and we're able to enforce the kind of counterinsurgency campaign against them as a function of that deal. Much harder. Salvador has actually a really good and interesting settlement and a huge demobilization and reintegration campaign that goes along with the FMLN fighters that come back into the government. And that's a piece that's just often overlooked. It would have to be a feature. It was an ongoing item of protest in Iraq. What were we going to do with folks who had fought for insurgent groups in Iraq? And it absolutely has to be part of the discussion in Afghanistan, both in terms of Taliban participation in international government, but also, how do you demobilize Taliban fighters? And that's, people don't really talk about that. It makes Americans really uncomfortable to think, that you would, what are you going to do? Invite them into the army? The answer is yes, but it's a question of when you can get there and when your local partners get there as well. But I think we've played a spoiler role in that as much as anybody else in some of these processes.
Are there any other questions from participants or from the other speakers?
Great questions, guys. Thank you so much.
Did you want to show the Afghanistan timeline?
Oh, no, that's just backup for me. Yeah.
Okay. All right. No other questions? Well, thank you so very much.
Thank you.